Hello, my fabulous fifth graders. Today's lesson is on how to write fractions as decimals. Our I can statement is I can write a fraction as a decimal and a decimal as a fraction. We're going to start by investigating what we know about fractions and decimals and thinking about what the relationship is between fractions and decimals. Now we know that both fractions and decimals are ways to talk about amounts that are less than a whole. If I had 1/2 of something, I would not have a whole. I would only have part of that whole. And if I had 1/10 of something, I would not have a whole. I would only have 1/10 of that whole. So fractions and decimals are different ways to name the same amount. Now, we already know how to write decimals as fractions because we know that 6/10 can be written as 6/10. We know that 13/100 could be written as 13/100. We also know that 4/1000 could be written as 4/1000. One thing we have to be aware of is that sometimes when we write our fractions, we may find that they are not in their simplest form. So we might have to simplify them. And as you remember, we need to find the greatest common factor of both the numerator and the denominator. So let's find factors of 6. Well, I know 1, 2, 3, and 6 are factors of 6. We also need to find factors of 10. 1, 2, 5, and 10. Now we need to look for the greatest common factor. The largest number on both lists is 2, so we're going to divide both the top and the bottom by my big 1. And inside my big 1 is a 2 over 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So another way to say 6/10 is in the simplified equivalent fraction of 3/5. But how can we take fractions and turn them into decimals? Let's see. Here they ask us to use a model to write 1/2 as a decimal. To write 1/2 as a decimal, we are going to first start by making an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 10. Now, why did we choose 10? That's because decimals are either tenths, hundredths, or thousandths. We could have made an equivalent fraction with any of these denominators, but the easiest one is going to be tenths. So let's try that. Remember, we have to think, well, what do I have to do to turn my 2 into a 10? Well, we need to multiply that 2 by 5. So inside my big 1, I've got 5 over 5. 2 times 5 is 10, and 1 times 5 is 5. So 5/10 is an equivalent fraction to 1/2. Now that I know the name of this fraction with 10 as a denominator, and I read 5/10, I can use what I know to write 5/10 as a decimal. So 1/2 equals 5/10 equals 5/10. These are all equivalent values. Try another example. The average weight of a tennis racket is 2/5 of a pound. Write this weight as a decimal. We're going to write 2/5 as a decimal. In order to do that, we need to write it as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 10. Again, we could have chosen tenths, hundredths, or thousandths, but the easiest one here is tenths. So I need to turn this into tenths. Again, what do I do to a 5 to make it a 10? Well, I turn a 5 into a 10 by multiplying by 2. That's why I need a 2 inside my big 1. 5 times 2 is 10, and 2 times 2 is 4. So 4 tenths is equal to 2 fifths. Since I know that 2 fifths and 4 tenths are equal, I can use my place value chart to read the decimal. 4 tenths. The average weight of a tennis racket is 4 tenths of a pound. Let's try a couple more. Here we have 2 fifths. Again, we're going to find an equivalent fraction with 10 as a denominator. Well, what do I do to a 5 to turn it into a 10? I multiply it by 2. So inside my big 1, I need 2 over 2. 5 times 2 is 10, and 2 times 2 is 4. I'm going to color that in here as 1, 2, 3, 4 tenths. 4 tenths and 4 tenths are equivalent. Let's try with 3 fifths. Again, I'm looking for an equivalent fraction with 10 as a denominator. What do I do to my 5 to turn it into 10? I multiply it by 2. Inside my big 1, I'm going to need a 2 over 2. 2 times 5 is 10, and 3 times 2 is 6. So 6 tenths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 tenths is equivalent to 6 tenths as a. Let's try one a little more complicated. Let's write 3 fourths as a decimal. Well, I know that I cannot turn 4 into tenths, so I need to come up with an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. Why did I choose 100? Because I know decimals are tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. Now, since I can't turn fourths into tenths, I'll have to go with hundredths. My goal is to turn this into an equivalent fraction with 100 as a denominator. 4 times what gives me 100? Well, I can think of what I know about quarters, and I know that 4 times 25 equals 100. If I multiply my denominator by 25, I must also multiply my numerator by 25. 3 times 25 is 75. So 75 hundredths is my equivalent fraction. Or I could read it as a decimal, like 75 hundredths. Let's do a couple more examples. Now 1/4, just like that last example, I know that I can't turn this into tenths, so I'm going to attempt to turn it into hundredths. I do that by multiplying 4 by 25. So that means I must have a 25 in my big 1. 4 times 25 is 100. 1 times 25 is 25. So 1/4 is the same as 25 hundredths. That would be 10 hundredths, 20 hundredths, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 25 hundredths. Let's try with 3 twentieths. Again, I'm looking for a denominator of 100. Now, what do I have to do to 20 to turn it into 100? Well, I could skip count. Let's see, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. I know that I had to multiply it by 5 to get to 100. Inside my big one, I'm going to have 5 over 5. 20 times 5 is 100, and 3 times 5 is 15. So 3/20 is the same as 15 hundredths. And to model that on my decimal model, I would color in 10 hundredths and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 15 hundredths. Let's do another couple practice. To write 1/5 as a decimal, well, 5 is a denominator that I can easily turn into tenths. I do that by multiplying the 5 by 2. Since I multiplied my denominator by 2, I also multiply my numerator by 2. 5 times 2 is 10. 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/5 is 2 tenths, or 2 tenths. Let's try 11/25. We write that as a decimal. I can't turn 25ths into tenths, so I'll look for a fraction with a denominator of 100. What do I need to do to turn my 25 into 100? Well, I multiply it by 4. So inside my big one, I've got 4 over 4. 25 times 4 is 100. 11 times 4 is 44. So 11/25 is 44 hundredths, or 44 hundredths. So that brings us to the end of today's lesson. On your whisk, you'll need to write today's I can statement. You can write, I can write a fraction as a decimal and a decimal as a fraction. Go ahead and press pause now if you need more time to add this to your whisk. Now this is your summarizing question. Do 3/5 and 6/10 represent equivalent numbers? Explain. Use complete sentences to explain whether this fraction and this decimal are equivalent. Now, for the Q section of our whisk, I'd like you to answer these two questions. The first one is write 4/5 as a decimal. The second is to write 18 hundredths as a fraction. Be sure to reduce to simplest form. Then I would like you to come up with a question like this and another question like this for your table partner to solve during tomorrow's math circle. I look forward to seeing what you come up with in class tomorrow.
Wow.